Welcome once again to This Week in Somalia and the World. Today, our guest is Omar Mahmoud, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group looking at Somalia. Today, he will talk to us about the new AMISOM Agreement to remain in Somalia for 2 more years as peacekeepers. For some of us, this was very interesting to see what would happen in terms of an agreement. It did seem that Somalia was pushing back very hard on the idea of extending the mandate, but a deal got done eventually. And I think there are also a few points that we'll talk about that are interesting in that it could lead to perhaps some monkeying with the system. But overall, do you think that this is a good deal for Somalia?
We had done some research which suggested also that, yes, AMISOM needs to go, but anything immediate would result in some security vacuums, and kind of pushed for a bit more of a longer-term plan, actually, but one that actually has significant reform built into it. I'm not sure this one has that much reform, at least initially, built into it. I do think you see some timelines associated with it. But you see 2 kind of trends within the document. One, that these are the specific timelines, but then everything's kind of conditions-based as well. And we've seen in the past how those timelines don't actually meet conditions. And part of the challenge we've seen is that this discussion about AMISOM's future has been happening, every year since at least 2016-17. And we kind of always come back to the same spot. And part of that, I think, is because there's always this focus on very rapid, quick timelines that ultimately prove unachievable. And so that's why we were kind of advocating for maybe a more structured, more thought out, longer term plan, but more of something clear going forward. Otherwise, I think we're in a similar situation where you have a 2 to 3 year window with some very quick timelines that ultimately it'll probably be difficult to meet them once again.
So it also, as you said, things are very general in terms of what needs to be accomplished. As you said, there are timelines where I think the first 9 months is spent trying to come up with a new plan. Is it possible to put together a strategy to concentrate on specific areas of the country, and therefore you can kind of measure, we've taken over 20%, 30%? It seems, that something more methodical might be more effective, or again, is this just window dressing and we're going to be in the same situation at the end of 2023?
Well, part of the challenge is how different of a threat Al-Shabaab is now than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I think we could measure success against Al-Shabaab in terms of territorial conquest. So we've taken back X% of territory. That means Al-Shabaab's not holding it. And the movement's worse off because of it. But that's not necessarily the case anymore because of how the movement's been able to adapt and adjust at a quicker rate than AMISOM, than the federal government, than others supporting it as well. And so you see Al-Shabaab's ability even to infiltrate government-held areas. And so I think the metric's no longer about holding control and measuring that. It's much more complicated. It's much wider dynamic to that. And a lot of the plans have still been based on this clear, hold, build model, where you clear their area from Al-Shabaab, then you hold it, and then you kind of start to build, and that's when the government services come back online. Clearing hasn't necessarily been the problem. Holding is where things have kind of gotten held up a bit because you're supposed to have a transition of forces during that time, and the holding forces aren't quite ready, and then building is proven quite complicated beyond that. So I think without getting outside that kind of dynamic, I do worry that we'll be in a situation where you'll see some reforms to AMISOM, you'll see some piecemeal changes. But 2 years from now, are we really going to be that dramatically different situation? My concern is probably not. But part of the challenge as well is trying to have these discussions right now when you have a political cycle ongoing, when you have an administration that's overstayed its mandate, and you might have a new one come in, you might have this one come back, but either way, you have perhaps some new guidelines around that. So part of the challenge is also just the politics around this right now.
Now, one of the clauses indicates that AMISOM will try to equip, I think, and build the capacity of the Somali security forces to do things on their own. This would seem to necessitate an end to the UN arms embargo. Is it possible for the African Union to make that happen?
Well, the arms embargo is still, something that needs to be brought up at the UN Security Council. It's consistently a talking point from the part of the federal government. There has been some restrictions that have been loosened over the past few years. So the whole embargo is still in place. It doesn't seem, from what I've seen, that there's appetite at this point in time to lift that. I think there's still some concerns around that. So it'll probably be difficult, or at least, making a plan based on the assumption that the arms embargo would be lifted might not be wise.
Now, another point in or difference in this new agreement is that the force commander will be appointed from the largest contingent of soldiers. To this point, it's been Uganda that's had the largest contingent, but the force commanders have been rotating. With the federal government getting to suggest which country should have the largest forces, and I think that somehow it's not clear what the mechanism is to approve that. But I guess you could see a situation where the Formaggio administration might want to promote Ethiopia as their top security partner. As well, what the New Deal says is that other countries will potentially send troops as well. And one could see Eritrea then perhaps contributing troops to this contingent. Are there dangers that whether it's Formaggio or another administration, that people are going to get cozy with a particular military, and that could be bad for Somalia in the long run?
Well, part of the challenge of AMISOM throughout its history has been that the troop contributing countries, certain ones have particular interests in Somalia. And if you look at a country like Ethiopia or a country like Kenya, they actually came into Somalia prior to rehashing to join in. So, that's a clear indication of their interests, particularly around the security realm. And command and control has been a consistent problem then within AMISOM because of that. Essentially you have different sectors where different TCCs, different countries are operating, and lots of times the coordination between them is quite difficult and quite complicated. So I think there's an attempt to address that in this new sort of plan here, but it doesn't seem that it's going to do that much to make the change. There's language around the contributing countries will have a greater commitment to the force commander, and the force commander will come from the largest countries. But I think, part of the issue is still those interests are always still going to be there, regardless of whether, the commanders from a particular country, regardless whether you have particular troops from the region and the neighbors and whatnot. Those interests are always going to be there, and that's part of the reason why usually in this type of operation you don't have frontline states involved. And so I think the idea to expand the pool of TCCs, at least to dilute that a little bit. So I think that can be useful in some regard, especially if TCCs come in with some new capabilities or some new energy and focus there. But at the same time, this is a very long uphill struggle that, I think just kind of the language here isn't going to fully resolve.
That was an interesting discussion of the new AMISOM Agreement. Do you want to give us a bit of a sneak preview of what you've been working on for the International Crisis Group?
One other report we're working on is the challenges and prospects of engagement with Al-Shabaab, because that is a key question in terms of the future of this conflict. Is there a pathway towards engagement? And there are obviously many challenges associated with that. And so we'll look at that in that upcoming research.
Excellent. We'll look forward to hearing more from you once you complete that document. Thank you, Omar Mahmoud from the International Crisis Group. We look forward to you joining us again.